Welcome to the inaugural Shelley lecture of the British Humanist Association. My name is Andrew Coxon. I'm the Chief Executive of the British Humanist Association. We have a calendar of events through the year. The Darwin lecture is held every February on a subject of relevance to Darwin himself, to his work, or to more recent developments in natural science. We have a Voltaire lecture every year on some aspect of philosophy or of humanism related to Voltaire. And we have a Holyoake lecture every year in Manchester. Holyoake is less well known than the other two. He was a founder not only of the secularist movement in the 19th century, but also of the cooperative movement, and it's held in Manchester for that reason. This year we're adding the Shelley lecture, and it's our intention that the lecture should be given every year on some subject relevant not necessarily directly to Shelley, but to literary culture, perhaps to history, other aspects of Shelley's life or what he stands for as they relate to humanism. And we're really pleased to be able to fill that sort of gap in our annual lecture series and have some wider representation of different themes and topics that are of interest to humanists. Well, we're having the Shelley lecture, the first Shelley lecture this year, because it's the 200th anniversary of that poet being sent down, expelled from this university for putting his pamphlet about the place that suggested there was no proof for a God. We'll hear more about that from our lecturer this evening, but first I'll introduce our chair, who has also put about books suggesting even more forcefully that there might not be a God, and who's very well known to all of you, Professor Richard Dawkins.
There's a very charming book called The Silent Traveller in Oxford by Chiang Yi, Chinese author, who wrote a number of books looking at the world through Chinese eyes. And the Silent Traveller in Oxford is a lovely book with beautiful Chinese-style pictures of Oxford. And one of them is a picture of what he labels a pair of freshmen sort of bounding up the stairs, a staircase in their college. A very Chinese picture of these Oxford freshmen. And Chiang Yi says, I could tell they were freshmen because I overheard one of them saying to the other, do you read much Shelley? Well, times have changed. Not that people don't read Shelley anymore, but that it's unlikely that you would identify a freshman by his habit of reading Shelley. Times have changed in another way. As Andrew intimated, one doesn't actually get sent down from Oxford nowadays for atheism. And as he said, it is the 200th anniversary this month of Shelley's being sent down for his pamphlet on the necessity of atheism. Anne Rowe is a distinguished historian and biographer. She is now the obituaries and briefings editor of The Economist. She's been on The Economist for quite a long time. Originally she covered American politics, and she's been the books and arts editor, US editor, and as I say, she now edits the obituaries page and writes most of the obituaries herself. She did her first-class history degree at Oxford and a DPhil in medieval history at Oxford. After that, she worked at the BBC World Service. She's written 5 books, Lives, Lies and the Iran-Contra Affair, 1991. She worked up her DPhil thesis into A Fool and His Money, Life in a Partitioned Medieval Town. She's written biographies of Pontius Pilate and of Perkin Warbeck, one of those pretended to be a prince in the Tower. And she's written a biography of Shelley. I'm not sure she calls it a biography, but it's a kind of biography of Shelley. And is this year's chairman of the Keats Shelley Prize. It's a great pleasure to ask Anne Rowe to give the inaugural Shelley lecture, which appropriately enough is on Shelley.
Thank you very much, Richard. Can everyone hear me? It's not working. Good. And thank you too to the British Humanists Association for inviting me to speak this evening. Had you been in this city 200 years ago, towards the end of February, you might have seen a tall, long-haired, slightly stooped young man race out of University College with a bundle under his arm. If you were one of the university authorities, you might already have been wary of this first-year student. Expensively but untidily dressed, with a proud, wild look, and known as a troublemaker. His name was Percy Bysshe Shelley. He was 18. He was the son of a Sussex landowner, but was already driving his father to distraction with his uncontrollable ways. He had been a star pupil at Eton, but had already made several attempts on the place with electrical machines and gunpowder. He crossed the High, passed the Bodleian, and he always strode, radiant with determination, towards Munday and Slatter's printing shop and stationers on the corner of the Broad. Mr. Munday had already published some of his poems, and in fact Shelley's father had asked him particularly to indulge his son in his, quote, printing freaks. The shopman's tolerance was about to be most severely tested. Once inside the door, Shelley put his bundle down, took out a handful of his booklets, and scattered them in the window and over the counter. Thus was published The Necessity of Atheism, a teenage tract by one of our greatest and most challenging poets that was seen by very few at the time, read by fewer, perhaps appreciated by none, said the proud author, but which today we've gathered to celebrate. It wasn't Shelley's unaided work. He'd been helped in it by his best friend at Union, Thomas Jefferson Hogg, and together they'd been feverishly plotting it all through the Christmas holidays. But Shelley was in charge of the final form of it, the printing and the distribution, and he knew what he was doing. He had chosen the title of his little tract, as he fondly called it, to cause maximum offence. Atheism was necessary. Necessary for progress, necessary for man's liberation. And it wasn't only necessary, but fated and inevitable, as mankind in history surged towards enlightenment, to give it the weight that it had for Shelley in 1811. Necessity kicks God out of the universe. They can't exist together. And Shelley is harnessing this force for his own purposes, dispersing his explosive material in a way that presages his wonderful lines in the Ode to the West Wind, written 8 years later in 1819. Scatter as from an unextinguished hearth, ashes and sparks, my words among mankind. Indeed, his words became ashes very quickly, in about 30 minutes, in fact. A local clergyman spotted the booklets, didn't need to read them, for the title was enough, had the whole lot swept up and ordered Mr. Slatter and Mr. Munday to burn them in the back kitchen. The repercussions were dire, as you've heard. Shelley and Hogg were hauled before the Master and Fellows of University College, were plied with questions about the pamphlets and refused to answer. So around this date, in fact on the 25th of March, they were expelled. Shelley had been at Oxford for less than 2 terms. He despised the place for many reasons. not least its intellectual narrowness and its pompous religiosity. He mocked his expulsion as proof of the weakness of his enemies' arguments, since, as he indignantly told his fuming father, quote, no argument was publicly brought forward to disprove our reasoning. But all the same, he was shattered to be thrown out. He became, thanks to his little tract and a liberal, cavalier attitude to marriage, an outcast both from his family and from the wider society. A man whose reputation for immorality cost him both readers and influence. A confirmed rebel against authority of every sort, whether God or man. As a result, he eventually sought exile in Italy in 1818, where he died in a freak sailing accident in 1822. His whole career as a poet, therefore, both in its shape and in its themes, could be said to have unfolded from the appearance of the necessity of atheism and from its equally swift disappearance. Suppose you'd been there with your 21st century sensibilities unchanged, and suppose you'd bought a copy. It cost sixpence, rather steep for only 14 pages, some of them blank. Or suppose you'd had it thrust urgently in your hand by Shelley, for this was urgent work to him. What would you have thought of it? The answer, I think, is that no reasonable person today would be in the least offended by it. You might say it was too rational. You might find its style galumphingly pompous, especially for an 18-year-old. Shelley does tell William Godwin, though, when he sends him a copy, that he has, quote, compressed it from much prolix reasoning. You might be aware that this young man is a prankster, and he's been writing atheistical letters to clergy and other poor, unsuspecting types for a while, pretending to be a Christian in confusion, saying the most shocking things in a way that looks polite on the surface. But there's no pranksterism about his booklet. It's short, serious, focused, and you can't argue with its clear, reasonable sincerity. The epigram comes from Bacon. The human mind cannot in any way accept as true that which lacks a clear and obvious demonstration. So there's the theme, a very polite request for proof of God's existence, but a passionate plea for truth, for its love of truth that has pushed Shelley to write this. And as he concludes, truth has always been found to promote the best interests of mankind. His arguments are very simple. In essence, they are Locke and Hume's arguments. Why do we believe in anything? Because we're convinced by the evidence of our senses, our own experience, or by the experiences of others. In the case of God, however, our senses don't tell us he exists, nor does our physical experience. Some say the world must have been created, but it's equally reasonable, and in fact easier, says Shelley, to suppose that it has existed for all eternity. The generative power itself, the first cause of life, does indeed seem beyond human understanding. But, says Shelley, to suppose that life is produced by, quote, an eternal, omniscient, almighty being doesn't help. In fact, it makes it even more incomprehensible. As for the testimony of other people, it is required, Shelley says sternly, that it should not be contrary to reason. And since such testimony is bound to be of miracles or other unreasonable things, it just won't do. Though Shelley doesn't mention it here, he writes elsewhere that there's no such thing as a miracle, only an event or an operation of nature that we don't yet understand. When God is subjected to the full glare of reason, he simply doesn't stand up. From this, it is evident, runs the last part of Shelley's argument, that having no proofs from any of the three causes of conviction, the mind cannot believe in the existence of a God. It is also evident that as belief is a passion of the mind, no degree of criminality can be attached to disbelief. Every reflecting mind must allow that there is no proof of the existence of a deity. To this, Shelley adds an unnecessarily cocky flourish, QED. And he signs his work in shouting capitals, through a deficiency of proof, an atheist. Yet apart from these provocations, there's nothing in the necessity of atheism that deserves the fire. Shelley simply asks quietly and logically for proof of God's existence, and he appeals to the bishops and heads of the Oxford colleges, to whom he has also sent copies, to answer his arguments, to set him right if he's wrong. Reasonable enough to us, but let's consider how this appeared in 1811. This was in fact the first openly atheist pamphlet ever published in England. That's how daring it was. At the time, a routine, unquestioning Anglicanism held sway both in Oxford and in England at large. A man like Shelley's father accepts it absolutely, for it underpins the social order and keeps revolution at bay. Revolution which, of course, has happened only 20 years before and only 20 miles across the Channel. A mere handful of radical thinkers, Tom Paine, William Godwin, for example, object to what, in Shelley's eyes, is an intolerable establishment of religion, a system of eternal punishments and rewards exacted by a tyrannical God who to Shelley is a sort of cross between a Hanoverian oaf like the Prince Regent and his own father. He sends his father a copy of The Necessity of Atheism too. Timothy Shelley scrawls impious on the title page. Shelley knows that truth will never flood into human minds until what he calls the false medium of religion is removed. People must learn to think for themselves and say what they think freely. But for most of those who are likely to hear or read him, this is Jacobinism, pure and simple. Sentiments like these lead straight to the terror and the guillotine. When Shelley calls himself an atheist, therefore, the first thing we must acknowledge is how brave he is. He joins a mere handful of people. And he knows the risks, which is why he gets his booklet printed not in London, but in distant Worthing. Though even there, the printer, Mr. Phillips, is advised to destroy the types in the manuscript in order to avoid prosecution. Shelley not only keeps his name off the pamphlet, but also off the covering letters he sends out with it, writing even to Godwin as, quote, Jennings Stukely, a common friend to nature, justice, and reason. He knows that men are being thrown in jail for radical opinions. He's already helped to raise money for them. Merely to be a deist, that is, to acknowledge a supreme being, but not the so-called truths of Scripture, could lead to prison, as happened to Tom Paine's publisher, Daniel Eaton, the next year. That particular incident encouraged another printed appeal by Shelley, his letter to Lord Ellenborough, the judge in the Eton case, pleading for freedom of speech and of the press. But in a way, the necessity of atheism goes deeper than that. It pleads for freedom of thought and for the removal of the monstrous, vengeful figure of God from human minds. Truth is my God, Shelley writes to Elizabeth Hitchener, an impressionable Sussex schoolmistress, later that year. And say he is air, water, earth, or electricity, but I think yours is reducible to the same simple divinity-ship. In other words, there's no awful being behind the universe, no one to tremble at, no one to fear. We should acknowledge, though, that atheism in 1811 didn't quite mean what it does 200 years later. An atheist then would often qualify as an agnostic now. It wasn't necessary to abjure all notions of the spiritual and the divine in order to be tagged an atheist. The word, as Shelley himself pointed out, still carried its ancient Greek meaning of one who condemned or opposed the gods while still admitting or implying that they were there. Shelley didn't admit they were there, but he also didn't say categorically that they weren't. What he did was intellectually milder in some ways than it sounded, but it was still brave to the point of recklessness. What led him to take this stand? Many motives, some worthy, some less so, some purely personal. He denied God first as a schoolboy at Eton, but atheism really starts bubbling up in his letters in the early autumn of 1810, when his irreligious opinions had put paid to his first romance with his pretty young cousin Harriet Grove. It's not just God he hates, it's Christianity. Oh, I burn with impatience for the moment of Christianity's disillusion, he writes to his friend Hogg that December, 2 short months before the necessity of atheism appeared. It has injured me. I swear on the altar of perjured love to avenge myself. He inveighs against Jesus too, more particularly and personally. I wish I were the Antichrist, he writes to Hogg in January 1811, that it were mine to crush the demon. He imagines himself battering Christianity with the systematic cudgel of his reasoning, and then twisting a dagger deep in Christ's breast, shouting out meanwhile his favourite words of Voltaire, "Écrasez l'infâme, crush the monster." If Shelley hadn't been frustrated in love, perhaps his hatred would have been a bit less fierce. But the simple urge to defend free thought, as we've seen, led him in the same direction. So did the urge to defy his parents. Sheer intellectual curiosity, his keenness to find a first cause behind the universe, added to his determination to shift God aside as an obstruction to free inquiry. Sheer love of argument kept his defiance burning. Christians will not argue, he complained disappointedly to Hogg in December 1810. It destroys the very nature of the thing to argue. It's contrary to faith. But Shelley also embraced the title of atheist for its drama and shock value. According to one friend, he had it written in his passport when he lived in Italy. Certainly he wrote it in a visitor's book, famously in 1816 at the Mer de Glace in Chamonix, in Switzerland, when he and Mary were visiting. Atheist, democrat, philosopher. The glory of the Alps was all around him. Others fell on their knees, taking that glory as proof of God's existence. But Shelley doesn't. 3 years before, in his poem Queen Mab, he had furiously lambasted man for bringing God into the world. The changing seasons, winter's leafless rain, the budding of the heaven-breathing trees, the eternal orbs that beautify the night, the sunrise and the setting of the moon, earthquakes and wars, and poison and disease, and all their causes, to an abstract point converging, thou didst bend and called it God. He is self-sufficing, the omnipotent, the merciful and the avenging God, who, prototype of human misrule, sits high in the heavens realm upon a golden throne, even like an earthly king, and whose dread work, hell, gapes forever for the unhappy slaves of fate, whom he created in his sport to triumph in their torments when they fell. This is what Shelley most loathes about the Judeo-Christian God, that he creates man, weak and prey to temptation, quote, and then damns him for being so. And what most irks him about man is that, like a slave, he accepts this. He doesn't have to. Where would God be, Shelley asks at the end of his poem Mont Blanc, the poem he wrote at Chamonix, if man didn't introduce him gratuitously and unnecessarily into every scene of life? And what were thou, and earth, and stars, and sea, if to the human mind's imaginings silence and solitude were vacancy? He joked about his atheism sometimes. As a fanatical tea drinker, he almost never took anything stronger. He once quipped that he didn't see how he would be an atheist when he was such a teaist. He loved the dramatic irony that he, the ardent benefactor of all mankind as he saw himself, would be labelled as a monster just because he didn't believe. His first wife, the very young Harriet Westbrook, admitted that he terrified her with his atheism, as he did with his tales of goblins and ghosts. He could scare friends too. The artist Benjamin Hayden records him at a dinner party in 1816, this boyish, sickly-looking creature, carving his vegetarian stalk of broccoli and remarking, "As to that detestable religion, the Christian." In his poem Julian and Madelo of 1818, in which he is talking about himself and Byron, Shelley describes the character Julian, who is himself as a complete infidel and a scoffer at all things holy. Infidel was a word he really liked. "They attack me for my detestable principles. I am reckoned an outcast," he crows in a letter 8 years earlier. "Yet I defy them and laugh at their inefficient efforts." If there was damnation in it, he dared to be damned. "May God, if there is a God, blast me." He sometimes implied he was an atheist just to shake people up. "I am a wolf," he told his friend David Trelawney in 1822, "and not in sheep's clothing." Yet there was seriousness behind the posturing. "Why do you call yourself an atheist?" Trelawney had asked him. "It annihilates you in this world." Shelley answered, "It is a word of abuse to stop discussion, a painted devil to frighten the foolish, a threat to intimidate the wise and good." So far so playful. But then, I used it to express my abhorrence of superstition. I took up the word as a knight took up a gauntlet in defiance of injustice. The injustice he meant was that, as he put it, the delusions of Christianity are fatal to genius and rationality. They limit thought. Believers, as he saw it, were forcibly prevented and prevented themselves from realizing their full, unfettered potential as rational human beings. The atheist walked free and stood tall, for he was above all that. He was also, inevitably, a political rebel. Government and established religion went hand in glove to tyrannize the country, as here in Shelley's great political ballad, The Mask of Anarchy. Clothed with the Bible as with light and the shadows of the night, like Sidmouth next, hypocrisy on a crocodile rode by. Sidmouth, of course, was the Home Secretary who had congratulated the yeomanry for cutting down peaceful protesters at Peterloo in 1819, and who had also in 1812 sent his agents out to spy on Shelley and the subversive leaflets he was sending out in bottles across the Bristol Channel. That was trying to prevent revolution in Ireland. The crocodile had long been Shelley's symbol of religion, a stiffly grinning totemic beast with torches blazing round it, fed on human fat and attended by wails of human misery. And then there are the priests, God's slaves, as he describes them in Queen Mab, lies driven from their tongues, who, quote, "while one hand was red with murder, feigned to stretch the other out for brotherhood and peace." Against all this apocalyptic horror stands the fearless, struggling figure of the atheist, who's always Shelley too, of course. Here is his first explicit appearance in Shelley's poetry in Queen Mab in 1813. In Shelley's first great description of the remaking of the world, once the old systems and superstitions have been swept away. "I was an infant when my mother went to see an atheist burned. She took me there. The dark-robed priests were met around the pile. The multitude was gazing silently, and as the culprit passed with dauntless mien, tempered disdain in his unaltering eye, mixed with a quiet smile, shone calmly forth. The thirsty fire crept round his manly limbs. His resolute eyes were scorched to blindness soon. His death pang rent my heart. The insensate mob uttered a cry of triumph, and I wept. 'Weep not, child,' cried my mother, 'for that man has said, there is no God. There is no God.' In his notes at the end of Queen Mab, Shelley thinks he must explain that phrase, and he takes the opportunity to reproduce the necessity of atheism again, almost word for word. But there's one significant difference from the original. His note begins, "This negation must be understood solely to affect a creative deity. The hypothesis of a pervading spirit, capital S, co-eternal with the universe, remains unshaken." Now what does Shelley mean by that? Is it a cop-out? Is he just covering his back here, hoping to protect his publishers from the thought police? I don't believe so. In 1817, when he agreed to tinker with bits of the Revolt of Islam, his huge description in verse of an improved version of the French Revolution, we know he toned down his atheistical ideas. But that was the only time he ever censored himself. Shelley doesn't do back covering. He doesn't wriggle or evade. Truth is my God, remember. In any case, Queen Mab was self-published, as the necessity of atheism was. He didn't have to put in such a caveat, but he did. And he did it again in his unpublished essay on Christianity, speaking without scorn or cynicism of, quote, "the interfused and overruling spirit," capital S again, "of all the energy and wisdom included within the circle of existing things." It seems, therefore, that our wolf-skinned atheist may not be quite as pure or as fierce as he appears. We can perhaps unravel his unbelief a little better by reading on in Queen Mab. There the atheist's death cry, "There is no God," is taken up by nature and by the endless cycles of life, death, and rebirth that point, in Shelley's eyes, to the eternal existence of the universe. No being has created it. It has always existed, and the unending vibration of the great chain of life echoes in the smallest things. "Let every seed that falls," he writes, "in silent eloquence unfold its store of argument. Infinity within, infinity without, belie creation. The exterminable spirit it contains is nature's only God." In other words, the notion of God is not too big for Shelley's universe. It's too petty, too limiting, too anthropomorphic, and too small. He's replaced it with spirit, a word I'm well aware that many modern atheists and humanists don't like any better. And though here in this early poem he makes it exterminable, the spirit that lives and dwells in Shelley's poetry, for he invokes it everywhere, often with reverence, only gets stronger through his life. "Wild spirit which art moving everywhere, destroyer and preserver, here, oh here," runs his ode, in fact a prayer to the west wind. His ode to liberty in 1820 invokes the power unknown, again capitalized. And here is a lesser-known fragment from his notebooks, written around 1817, in which, as in the West Wind, he also includes the idea of passivity, of veneration, of surrender. "There is a power whose passive instrument our nature is, a spirit that with motion invisible and swift, its breath hath sent amongst us, like the wind on the wild ocean. This spirit, chained by some remote devotion, our choice or will demandeth not nor heedeth, but for its hymns doth touch the human souls it needeth." So what is this spirit? Certainly it is a what and not a who, though vague, dazzling female figures sometimes seem to represent it. Sometimes too Shelley calls this spirit thou, though without any religious baggage it seems, for God and superstition have been thrown out so decidedly that he's starting again with a clean slate. In his more rational early works, he applies the words fate and necessity to the motive force of the universe. But in those same early writings, indeed in the January just before the necessity of atheism appears, he's fixed on another name for it, quote, "the spirit of love, the harmonized intelligence of infinite creation." Love, love infinite in extent, eternal in duration. And to the end of his life, in his notebooks, this is what it is, love. The reason he wrestles with it so, and feels he must somehow identify it, is because as a poet, something regularly comes to take possession of him. It moves over him as though body and mind were the highly stretched strings of a lyre. Its visitations, as he writes in his wonderful essay, A Defense of Poetry, in 1821, are like, quote, the interpenetration of a diviner nature through our own, but its footsteps are like those of a wind over the sea, which the coming calm erases, and whose traces remain only as on the wrinkled sand which paves it. Poetry, in fact, he says, redeems from decay the visitations of the divinity in man. Again, what does he mean? You can read this passage in two ways. That divinity comes into man, or that divinity is within man to begin with and prompts him from within. You might prefer that he had nothing to do with the word at all, that he used it often and not like God as a sort of football. For Shelley, God and divinity were not remotely related. It seems to me that Shelley gives the word both these meanings. There is for him a spirit beyond man, call it necessity or liberty or love or whatever you will, but that spirit is also within him, coexisting, co-eternal, in every way equal, unslaved, unenslavable, unbound and boundless. So for Shelley, there's nothing divine or sacred in religion or in God. What is sacred lies in man. The human mind and imagination and the human heart, Shelley doesn't very clearly differentiate between all those, are where all the power of the universe, all its motion and potential, come to a still focal point, a stillness before they're worked on and sent out again into unbounded space. Imagination, for Shelley, bursts from that tiny point, like a glowing coal within, he writes elsewhere, to be strong and dazzling like the sun. It is, quote, the faculty which contains within itself the seeds at once of its own and of social renovation. Liberty, too, bursts out of human hearts, thine own pure soul moulding the mighty whole, as he puts it in his new version of the national anthem in 1819. Infinite, unending love lives and gathers force there. Unfettered, unenslaved, free-thinking man, loving and imagining, therefore has the whole power of the universe at his disposal. He or she can unleash an almost nuclear potential to make the world anew. Here is Shelley's most passionate expression of this from the last act of his great lyrical drama, Prometheus Unbound. The lightning is his slave, heaven's utmost deep gives up her stars, and like a flock of sheep they pass before his eye, are numbered and roll on. The tempest is his steed, he strides the air, and the abyss shouts from her depths laid bare, Heaven, hast thou secrets? Man unveils thee, I have none. Shelley has indeed disposed of God in his universe, and in his place, striding like a colossus, is man. Shelley's divinity is his own true inner self, himself as he could be. Men and women, if they have only the will and the desire, can become God, but not a God who oppresses, instead a God who sets free. It's all there, all within the temple of the heart, all possible. And it begins with asking questions. When we decided to call this talk The Necessity of Atheism Then and Now, I wasn't sure how much now could usefully be in it. The explosive power of Shelley's little booklet has drained away with time, and there are probably much more incendiary things on sale in Broad Street now. Our age is secular, and in the West at least, thought is free. In a way, Shelley's battle seems won. But his fundamental theme is still as useful as ever. we ought to ask the awkward questions. We ought never to accept explanations for life's largest mysteries, basically why and how, just because our elders hand them down to us. Shelley argued that he refused to let arguments go. Contemporaries complained about it. But he hung on because he genuinely wanted to reach new places through the clash of ideas in Plato's best style, and because the exercise of mind and imagination was the proper deployment of man's godlike power. The necessity of atheism was his first explicit challenge to the world in what became a whole series of challenges to men and women, to free themselves, improve themselves, rethink and rebuild society, start a revolution that would really work, not like the French one, to change everything. I'm very aware that this is the first of a projected annual series of Shelley lectures, and in some ways we may have been a bit disappointed in some of the things Shelley has said as this talk has gone on. In truth, he doesn't make a comfortable patron for any groups who try to adopt him. Marxists and socialists, for example, revere him as a political radical, but alongside his calls to liberty and equality comes a real repulsion for mankind in a mass and an instinctive aristocratic liking for government by the enlightened few. Feminists claim him for his fine words on the emancipation of women, but he treated both his wives badly, and in the manner of his time he was pretty patronising towards women in general. Atheists had embraced him for a long time as a free, untrammeled, disobedient being, and he often was. But Hogg, his closest friend, said he'd never met anyone in whom, quote, the spirit of veneration was so strong. And I agree. Simple humanism, however, seems a better fit. I can't think of another poet who believes more strongly in the power and potential of the human being, the human mind and the human imagination. These are the only tools for Shelley that could build a better world. Since the fascist horrors of the 20th century, we approach ideas of human perfectibility with a good deal more caution now. But Shelley's revolution in his own mind had to begin with a profound shift in the moral sense before it could usefully become political. He thought that shift would take, quote, perhaps 1,000 years. Such a moral revolution, grounded in love and unselfishness, turning the force of the universe out from the heart to improve the lot of humanity, now has exemplars we can look to. Mahatma Gandhi, Martin Luther King, for two of them. But Shelley would be the first to say that his revolution has barely started yet. Men and women have to understand the power they have. As Shelley once urged on his timid friend Miss Hitchener, dare to believe I am great. One decisive step towards his revolution happened here 200 years ago. A shock-head young man, barely out of school, dared to ask a question: what are the proofs of the existence of God? The authorities refused to answer, punished him severely, and destroyed what he had written, but he refused to back down, and in everything else he wrote, kept campaigning for truth. As a friend put it, with his little tract, Shelley, quote, even dared threaten the world with the horrid and diabolical project of telling mankind to open its eye. He refused to let the world stay blind, wedded to its old ideas. He wanted to shake it up as only a self-proclaimed atheist could. You could say he let the wind blow in, that wild west wind, the spirit of change, which is also, incidentally, the only principle Shelley ever prays to.